I just wanted to make an announcement ahead of time that we had some technical difficulties in the air quality committee, so we're starting a little bit late because of that. And it's possible we will continue to have some technical difficulties with the presentation, but the staff is doing the best that they can. So we'll proceed. On the preliminary matter, General Statute 138A-15 mandates that I inquire as to whether any member knows of any known conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to matters before the Environmental Management Commission's Groundwater and Waste Management Committee. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of conflict, please so state at this time. Hearing none, we can move on. The next item is approval of the summary from the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee meeting on January 12, 2002. I've had an opportunity to review those minutes and I didn't have any changes. Do we need a discussion on the minutes? Do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
I wasn't here, so I'm gonna go make the motion. So I wasn't at that meeting, so. Gotta be another committee member gonna make the motion.
Commissioner Rrc, move to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Commissioner Rrc. And do we have a second?
Suzanne Lazoric, I'll second.
Thank you, Commissioner Lazoric. All in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Any not in approval? So the minutes are approved. Today we have no action items, so we're going to move on to informational items. And the first one is the overview of the request for the EMC to adopt rule text modifications to 15A NCAC 2L0202 groundwater quality standards made in response to the Rule Reviews Commission objection based upon ambiguity. And we have Bridget Shelton to present. Thank you, Bridget.
Great, thank you. Good morning. I'm Bridget Shelton. I'm the Groundwater Standards Coordinator with the Classifications and Standards Rules Review Branch in the Division of Water Resources. So I'm here today to present an information item that will be an overview of an action item that will be presented to the full commission tomorrow. So this is an overview of tomorrow's request for the EMC to adopt rule text modifications that were made to the 15A NCAC 02L0202 groundwater quality standards rule. These modifications were made in response to the Rules Review Commission's objection to the rule based on ambiguity and clarity issues. So some very brief background, as you all have seen this item a few times now. So the division reviewed the 15A NCAC 02L0202 groundwater quality standards rule text, as well as the current interim maximum allowable concentrations, or Imacs, and proposed amendments to the rule based on this review. These amendments included the adoption of groundwater standards for a number of substances that had Imacs, also the addition of a groundwater quality standard for a few substances which did not currently have Imacs, as well as updates to the rule for clarification and organization, and rule text revisions to add an Imac notification process and to clarify the triennial review process and procedure. So EMC approved of the hearing officer's report and the proposed amendments at the November 18th, 2021 meeting of last year. And then the Rules Review Commission reviewed these EMC approved amendments at their February 17th, 2022 meeting, so last month. The RRC staff opinion is included as an attachment to this item, and for tomorrow's action item, I just wanted to go over that quickly. So paragraph C of this 02L0202 rule requires that when there is no groundwater standard for a substance, and that substance is not naturally occurring, the substance is not permitted in groundwaters of the state in concentrations at or above the PQL, or the practical quantitation limit. So as a reminder, the PQL is the lowest concentration of a given material that can be reliably achieved among laboratories. It is an analytical laboratory value. It is not based on human health or any toxicity values. Paragraph C of this rule also allows the director to modify that PQL requirement for these substances in groundwater through the use of an Imac, or an interim maximum allowable concentration, which is a human health-based protective value. So General Statute 150B-19(6) states that agencies may not waive or modify a requirement set in a rule unless the rule establishes specific guidelines the agency must follow in determining whether to waive or modify the requirement. So the PQL is a requirement in the rule that can be modified with the establishment and use of an Imac if the rule has specific guidelines that must be followed to modify this requirement. So again, the RRC staff opinion is provided as an attachment, and it lays out a bit more detail on this subject. So the RRC objected to the rule at their February meeting, finding that the rule was not clear and unambiguous. The RRC objection letter is also included as an attachment for this item. Specifically, as written in the objection letter, the RRC found that the rule was unclear and ambiguous as it lacked specific guidelines required by GS 150B-19(6) to waive or modify the practical quantitation limit requirement through the use of an Imac. So the division has made rule text modifications to satisfy the RRC's objection based on ambiguity and clarity issues. The rule text document included as attachment A for this item has those recommended changes, as well as the other technical changes that were made after discussions with RRC counsel prior to the RRC meeting. The changes that the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee and that the EMC have not seen are highlighted in yellow. So I did want to focus specifically on paragraph C for these next slides. This is the paragraph where the IMACs are first referred to and where the Imac establishment process is laid out. So this paragraph is where we made most of the technical changes to try to provide more clarity in order to satisfy the RRC's objection. So as I mentioned, everything highlighted in yellow is a new change that the EMC has not seen. In this paragraph here, this highlighted text is mainly adding clarifications such as references to other parts of this rule and references to other rules. We add language about modifying the requirement to make it very clear what the purpose of the IMACs are. So any person may request the director of DWR to modify the PQL requirement by establishing an Imac for a substance in accordance with the specific guidelines listed below. In addition, any person may request the director of DWR to update or remove an existing Imac in accordance with the specific guidelines below. So continuing with paragraph C, right after that previously shown text, we now start to list those specific guidelines that the division must follow in order to determine whether to modify the PQL requirement. So the specific guidelines are as follows, starting with 1. So this is new language, but it is not a new practice. We're just making it clear here that the division initially reviews the Imac requests that we receive to make sure that the data and information submitted is in accordance with paragraphs D and E of this rule, which those paragraphs lay out the calculations and references required to calculate a health-based standard. So making sure the information submitted is complete and appropriate. So moving on to 2, this language was already approved by the EMC, but it states that if the information is submitted is not in accordance with paragraphs D and E, the director shall request additional information from the requester. If that appropriate additional information is not provided, the director shall return the request. And the struck out language about an annual update to the EMC at the end here does appear later. We had just struck it out to show that it has been moved from this guideline, but it will appear later. Continuing again with C, moving on to guideline 3. So again, most of this language has already been seen and approved by the EMC. The director receives an Imac request, the information submitted is reviewed, and if it is determined to be in accordance with paragraphs D and E of this rule, the division will provide public notice and opportunity for comment at least 30 days before an Imac is established, updated, or removed. The public notice will include the information listed here in A through D. We added language to B here to be sure it's clear that there are guidelines for the calculations for these Imacs in the rule. And the notice shall be emailed to interested parties and posted on the division's website listed here. So moving on to step 4 for the specific guidelines to establish an Imac. The first half of the paragraph shown here is not new practice. We just added the language in to be very clear on the basis of which the director establishes an Imac. This language was actually pulled from O2L 0103, which sets out the policy for the whole subchapter. So again, this was always our practice and how we operated. We just wanted to have the language here to make it clear what the basis is for how the director establishes, updates, or removes an IMAC. So if the director of the Division of Water Resources finds the establishment, update, or removal will not degrade the quality of the groundwaters, will not likely cause or contribute to pollution of the waters of the state, and will be protective of public health, then the director shall establish, update, or remove the IMAC. The request does not meet the requirements listed in this subparagraph, the director of DWR shall return the request. So the second half of this paragraph's language is adding a timeline to the IMAC establishment process in order to provide more specificity to the guidelines for the IMAC establishment process. So the director shall establish, update, or remove the IMAC or return the request within 180 calendar days of receipt of a request submitted in accordance with paragraphs D and E of this rule, unless the requester agrees in writing to a longer period. Failure by the director to establish, update, or remove an IMAC or return the request within 180 days of receipt of a request submitted in accordance with paragraphs D and E of this rule shall be considered a return of the request. So moving on to 5, again, most of this language here has been seen by the EMC. Here we are keeping the public and the commission informed of these IMAC activities. So if the director establishes or updates an IMAC, the IMAC shall be posted on the website and the commission shall be notified in writing within 30 calendar days and at the next regularly scheduled commission meeting that a new IMAC has been established or an existing IMAC has been updated or removed. So again, just keeping the public and the commission aware of these IMAC activities. So step 6 for the guidelines to modify the PQL requirement with an IMAC establishment. So there were some concerns brought up by the RRC about it not being very clear in the rule how long the modification or the IMAC remains in place. We wanted to add language and a timeline here to be clear that once these IMACs are established, the division will be moving them towards the commission or to rulemaking. So within 12 months of establishing an IMAC pursuant to this paragraph, the director of DWR shall make a recommendation to the commission whether, 1, a new groundwater standard in place of the IMAC shall be established pursuant to this rule, or 2, the IMAC should expire. After a recommendation is presented by the director under subparagraph C6A of this rule, the commission shall decide whether rulemaking shall be initiated to adopt a new groundwater standard in place of the IMAC. If the commission initiates rulemaking to adopt a new groundwater standard in place of the IMAC, then the IMAC shall remain in effect until it expires under the next subparagraph that I'll go over in a little bit. So just to walk through an example of this text here. So the director of the DWR receives an IMAC request for a particular substance. The guidelines listed earlier are followed and the IMAC is established. Then the division has 12 months to come to the commission with a recommendation on whether a groundwater standard is needed for this substance that has an IMAC, or if the IMAC modification should expire and the PQL would then become the requirement for this substance. After the recommendation is presented, the EMC will then decide whether rulemaking shall be initiated. If rulemaking is initiated to adopt a standard in place of the IMAC, that IMAC modification will remain in effect during the rulemaking unless the IMAC expires. So that brings us to 7. So we added language here to address the RRC's concerns about the ambiguity of how long these IMACs may stay in place. So we added the clarification here that under certain circumstances, an IMAC can expire. So an IMAC shall expire upon the earliest of 1, or A, the date the commission declines to initiate rulemaking to adopt a new groundwater standard in place of the IMAC under subparagraph C6B of this rule, or B, the effective date of a rule adopted by the commission establishing a new groundwater standard in place of the IMAC, or C, after initiating rulemaking pursuant to subparagraph C6C of this rule, the date the commission declines to adopt a new groundwater standard in place of the IMAC. So again, to walk through an example of this text here, so an IMAC has been established following the guidelines covered earlier, and within 12 months, the division comes to the EMC to make a recommendation on the path of this IMAC. If the EMC declines to initiate rulemaking on this IMAC, which is A here, that IMAC will expire on the date of that decision. The other option is the EMC decides to initiate the rulemaking and eventually adopts a new groundwater standard in place of the IMAC, which is option B here. In this case, a groundwater standard now exists for this substance, and the previous IMAC for this substance expires on the date of the rule adoption for this rulemaking. And then the last option here is C. The EMC decides to initiate rulemaking, and after the rulemaking process is almost complete, after public notice and comments are received, the EMC decides to not adopt a groundwater standard for a substance to replace an Imac. So the date of that decision is when that Imac will expire. So this language here is kind of covering all the options for the path of an Imac. And finally, moving on to step 8 of the guidelines. So this language here is just clarifying that although there are circumstances where an Imac may expire, any person may still request that an Imac be established again. They may request an Imac for the substance again based on new information or new site information that was not included in the original Imac request. So this Imac may be established if the specific guidelines covered earlier are followed. And finally, 9. So this is that language that I mentioned had been struck out earlier. We just moved it to the end of the guidelines here to describe the process more accurately. So the director of DWR shall provide an annual update to the commission on the status of pending Imac requests and any Imacs that have been established, updated, or removed during the previous calendar year. So just providing a lot of updates to the commission on these Imac activities. So I just covered the rule modifications to paragraph C. Before moving on, I just wanted to mention paragraph G of this rule. It's not in the slides here, but if you look at the rule text attachment, you can see that we did strike through some language that referred to the Imac review process in paragraph G. There was some confusion when Imacs were referenced in 2 different paragraphs. So we modified the text in G to only refer to the triennial review of the established groundwater quality standards. So really cleaning up that paragraph a bit. We took out references to Imacs in paragraph G and added a clearer process for the establishment and review of these Imacs to paragraph C, as I've just shown here. So that language we believe is no longer needed in G. So just wanted to point that out. So to briefly go over the anticipated rulemaking schedule here. So the committee has seen this item a few times now. The full EMC approved of the hearing officer's report and the rule text in November of last year. Rrc reviewed this rule and objected to it based on ambiguity in February of this year. Tomorrow, we are asking for approval of the rule text modifications to satisfy the Rrc's objection. And if approval is received tomorrow by the full EMC, we will then go back to the Rrc for their approval, which would make the effective date May 1st, 2022. So here's just an overview of what our requested action for the EMC tomorrow will be. So the division is requesting that the EMC adopt the rule text modifications to 15A NCAC 02L 0202 groundwater quality standards to satisfy the Rules Review Commission's objection. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget.
Madam Chair,
Yes,
if you don't-
I'd like to recognize our council.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to give a brief note to the committee in lieu of tomorrow that I really appreciated working with the staff on this process. There was a lot of back and forth and with Bridget as well as Karen Higgins and Jeff Manning, and fortunately they were able to prepare me well for presentation to Rrc, and it was a very close vote. It was a 5-4 vote as to the objection, and they I think we were able to get an objection that the commission will be able to satisfy very well. But I felt compelled to express my appreciation to the staff. In fact, when I got done making my presentation to the Rrc, I asked Bridget, "Well, how did you think I did?" She said, "Well, you did really well. I was really surprised about how much you were able to learn about these things." So, which I took as a compliment and not just an acknowledgement of my ignorance. Yeah, it was. But that was because of their effort to educate somebody who probably did more of a B- C+ work in high school and these things. So I just wanted to express my appreciation again and say that I feel like these rules will satisfy the objection of the Rrc.
Well, before I take some other questions from the other committee members, I guess one question I have for you is, it's obvious there's a lot of changes. There's a lot of highlighted yellow sections. And I know that there were discussions about how to satisfy the Rrc objection. So, Council Reynolds, can you address that? I mean, normally if we had this many changes, you'd have to go out to public hearing again.
Right. So as part of the Rrc's review, the EMC doesn't have the ability right now to go out on its own to republish it, but the RRC has the authority to direct the agency that there are substantial changes or to determine whether substantial changes have been made. A lot of people equate substantial with a quantitative evaluation and not necessarily with whether the effects have changed. I don't think the effect of the rule has changed. It would not surprise me if the RRC asked that question, or consider that in some regard, but I don't think, looking at the three broad criteria that's in statute to determine whether a substantial change has occurred, I don't think that these changes reach that level because they don't produce an effect that wasn't already anticipated or could be anticipated with what went out to public comment. And a lot of what you see in yellow is just the moving around of the words to address the clarity concerns, both as part of the technical change request before it went to the RRC and now after the fact. And most of the changes that are included relate to the commission's direction about its delegation to the division director about how that delegation of authority will be exercised. So it's more requirements on the division director than it is about adding new or additional requirements on the regulated community. Those things, by and large, remain the same. So I can envision that there may well be a question by the RRC about that, but I don't think that this is a substantial change, even though there is a lot of yellow on the page.
Thank you. And then a question for Bridget is, there are some IMACs that weren't included in this development of this set of standards. And now we have this language in here about the expiration of an IMAC. Has the staff discussed how those would be managed?
Yeah, so waiting to see what happens with the rule, but
Right.
we're reviewing the path forward for those.
Okay, so no decision yet on how that would fit into this new timeline.
No,
that's
but yeah,
in the
we
rule.
have thought of that and we are keeping that in mind.
And one thing I had wondered about, just in a broad way of looking at this, is since an IMAC is not a standard, maybe we want to have a standalone section for IMACs so that the next time we do the triennial review, we might separate it out into its own section and just have the standards
Yes.
on their own, because this is different. And that's been one of the confusions through our whole process, is because it's different things we're looking at to establish an IMAC versus a standard.
Yes.
So I'd hope to see that. Now I'll open it up to any of the other commissioners. Any other questions? Well, you're off the hook, Bridget.
Not yet. I think I have another update again.
Right, you have that tomorrow, but we're the toughest group.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Bridget. But don't step away, because right now you're going to review the status of pending IMAC requests submitted to the Division of Water Resources, which are pending and not established yet.
Yes, so I don't have a PowerPoint for this. It's just a quick update. So yeah, we were asked to give an update on the IMAC requests that we have received by the division and are pending or were pending. So during this most recent review and the ongoing rulemaking for the O2L 0202 groundwater standards rule, we did have one pending IMAC request, which we received in April of 2018. This was a request made by Chemours for the PFAS compound HFPO dimer acid, otherwise known as GenX. At the time that DWR received the request to establish an IMAC for GenX, there was limited toxicological data available to calculate a standard, and there were no values available from the EPA at that time. In November of 2018, the EPA did publish a draft toxicity assessment for GenX, which then went through an external review and a public comment period. This toxicity assessment was finalized and published in October of last year, so October 2021. The final toxicity value that was published was lower than the 2018 draft value because EPA looked at new studies published after the completion of the 2018 draft assessment. And then, just as a heads up, EPA is currently in the process of developing a drinking water health advisory for GenX. And a very recent update, so on March 1st, 2022, so last week, Chemours requested that the April 2018 Imac request submission be deactivated. So at this time, the division has no pending Imac requests.
Thank you. And I understand that a lot of work went into determining if there were any other pending ones out there, and that we contacted industry associations to verify that this was the only one pending request.
Yes.
And now it's been, now we've heard from the petitioner that they're not interested in pursuing it now.
Yes, that's correct.
And then, like I said, we do have some other IMACs that have been established, but that weren't put into standards, but that's a different issue. Are there any questions from the commission members?
Yeah, just one question. In that regard, will the department come back with a recommendation for a standard now? And I know in the beginning with all the unknowns, we had thought about this IMAC and I guess Chemours did, but is there
It's
not
good
a
question.
greater,
I'm
is
not
there not a
sure.
greater public interest now and a lot more known that we could go into a
Yeah.
standard without not going to an IMAC?
That's a great question. I'm not sure if I can answer that. We'll have to have conversations with the department on the path forward.
If you would, please, I'm curious.
That's a good question. Thank you, JD. Any other questions or comments about this presentation? Hearing none, we'll move on to item number 3, update on the plan required by SL 2021-165, H951, for financial assurance for decommissioning of utility scale solar facilities, which Director Scott will present. And this is something that we've been very interested in the past couple of years.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. As stated, I'm Michael Scott, Director of the Division of Waste Management. Today we'll be presenting on the specific plan required by that House Bill 951, as you see on the screen, asking the department to evaluate financial assurance for decommissioning of utility scale solar facilities. Dylan, you mind helping with the slides? I don't know if I could advance the next slide, please. So a little bit of background here. There's been 2 pieces of legislation before the North Carolina General Assembly that have touched on solar panel decommissioning, and more specifically, the potential for financial assurance requirements related to that. So if some of you remember, as committee members and commission members, there was House Bill 329 that was ratified back in 2019. It did require not only the department, but also the Environmental Management Commission to evaluate the establishment of a regulatory program to govern the management of end-of-life renewable energy equipment. And it wasn't just solar panel or solar farms. It included wind energy facilities, battery storage systems, and was a very comprehensive piece of legislation. And also, as you see here, the decommissioning of utility scale solar projects. There was a very robust stakeholder process that occurred in the development of that plan. Ultimately, it was presented to this body, the Environmental Management Commission, and was submitted as a final report to the General Assembly back in January of 2021. And we'll talk a little bit more about that report. Here today, we're here to speak more specifically about House Bill 951, which was ratified back in October of last year. And this specific piece of legislation, as you see, required our department to develop a plan by March 1st, earlier this month, and it has been submitted and was submitted on the due date of March 1st to the General Assembly to ensure adequate financial resources for the decommissioning of utility scale solar projects. And it's in an attachment along with the other legislation and the previous 329 report. It does include plan and recommendations as required by the session law for financial resources, or essentially financial assurance for the decommissioning of utility scale solar projects. Next slide, please, Dylan. So when we talk about the initial piece of legislation, it's important to understand that historical perspective. In the development of potential rules, our department was to consider, along with the Environmental Management Commission, 9 specific aspects, and I'll be glad to walk through all of them, but 2 of them specifically touched on decommissioning and financial assurance, and that theme was brought forward in the additional legislation, meaning House Bill 951. And as part of that previous report, once again, that came before the commission, we looked at surveying other federal requirements, state requirements relating to the management of end-of-life utility scale renewable energy equipment. And also, could it be reused? Could it be refurbished? What would happen if we needed to dispose of it? Would it be a solid waste, a hazardous waste? All the criteria associated with that, including the potential to recycle this equipment and also properly decommission it and provide financial assurance if it were needed. And a big question was, and a part of that report, whether or not financial assurance requirements are necessary to ensure proper decommissioning of those operations. So we evaluated those 9 aspects, put it before this body, the EMC, and discussed the summary of that evaluation in that January 1st, 2021 report, and is attached as one of your attachments as attachment B. The overarching conclusion was that specifically related to solar facilities, and I have a slide that supports this, but we're still quite a few years from the decommissioning of those sites, with typical lifespans greater than 20 years is what the industry typically states. And one of the main conclusions in that report was that immediate regulatory programs were not needed to be created within DEQ. We have a solid waste program, we have a hazardous waste program, we have a division that assists with recycling and management of materials that don't go for final disposal. So one of the big conclusions was that immediate rule development, the establishment of a regulatory program or programs was not needed. Next slide, please, Dylan. So that brings us back to the current status in the state and that piece of legislation that was passed last year that required us to revisit this. So that was the January report, then October legislation that asked us to revisit this piece on solar decommissioning and financial assurance. And some of the background information that's important here is I think most of us know that North Carolina is one of the nation's leaders when it comes to the number of solar facilities within our state, with California and Texas and Florida being some of the other major states with significant solar being present within their borders. We have about 5,100 megawatts of grid connected solar power, and it's supplied by more than 660 facilities that are greater than 1 megawatt in size. And you typically hear this 1 megawatt or 2 megawatt threshold as an effort to exclude some of the residential or rooftop power. It's utility scale solar sites that we're primarily focused on, meaning greater than 1 megawatt in size. Across North Carolina, they are in 79 of the 100 counties, and typically the land where these facilities are is leased to the solar developer by the landowner. Based on the information we've obtained from the Energy Information Administration, there's approximately 50 facilities that are expected to be added to North Carolina each year, providing an additional 500 megawatts of power to the grid each year. So not only do we currently have a universe that puts us as one of the top 5 states in the country for the amount of utility scale solar, but there's also expected growth in this industry across our state. And we do expect them to get larger in size. And we have a graph or a bar graph that'll kind of give you a better illustration of this. But most of the facilities we do expect to be 5 megawatts or larger. So that plays into the size of the footprint, the amount of acres, the amount of material that may have to be managed at end of life. Next slide, please, Dylan. So this slide we've used within the plan and draw from it quite often. It goes back to 2008. You had Senate Bill 3 and significant pieces of legislation like House Bill 329 and 951 that we talk about when it comes to this industry. And you see back to 2008 through 2020, this particular depiction gives us an idea of the number of facilities established within the state and the size of them. And once again, this is important as we see the trends with these facilities getting bigger, which means additional acreage and then more material that may eventually have to be managed at decommission, whether it's recycled, refurbished, repowered, or some pieces have to be disposed of. These are important trends to have in mind. Most facilities, as you see supported here, are in the 5 to 20 megawatt range. 92% of our facilities are greater than or equal to 2 megawatt. And as we've stated, for the most part, facilities are getting a bit larger and are above 5 megawatts when they're currently built. And about 50 facilities, as we've stated, are expected to come online each year. Next slide, please, Dylan. So when we talked a lot about, even before the EMC, a little over a year ago, about specifically decommissioning solar facilities and what may or may not be needed regarding regulatory programs, a big piece and for some of those decision points were when these solar facilities would come offline or need to be decommissioned. Yes, maybe they could be repowered. Yes, maybe they would last longer than 20 or 25 years, but these are graphs that we use to draw some of those conclusions regarding when specifics on decommissioning or specifics on financial assurance may be needed for the industry in North Carolina. So as you can see here, there are peaks regarding the particular timeframes around 2035 through 2038 when we do expect a large number of facilities in North Carolina, and depicted here as number of solar panels, may need to come offline. Once again, we do recognize there's an ability to repower, or panels may last a little longer than originally thought, but this is the time frame, meaning not in this current decade when we may see significant amounts of decommissioning occurring in North Carolina. Next slide, please, Dylan. We also felt it was important, this is an issue that the counties have already embraced, right? They're issuing zoning permits, and we had this conversation, Madam Chair, in our other committee meeting. What's the current involvement with DEQ versus the current involvement at the local level regarding the establishment of these facilities? And one important note is we put together this plan as required by the legislation was to evaluate what counties in North Carolina already have certain requirements. And so this is a good illustration showing in green counties that already have financial assurance and decommissioning requirements for solar facilities that come into their respective counties. The yellow coded counties would only have decommissioning requirements. So they would require what has to be done to remove the panels, remove the infrastructure, reclaim the site, basically back to a greenfield type status, but may not have a bond or a letter of credit or cash, meaning a financial assurance mechanism for solar facilities in those respective counties. This does reflect information we were able to pull as a department at the county level. There are specific landowner lease agreements, which obviously would occur as someone allows a solar developer to use their property. There's specific legal documents between that property owner and the solar developer. We're not privy to all of those documents, obviously, and so we have put down at the bottom of this slide that point that this is drawn from the county level. Next slide, please, Dylan. So when we look at this breakout to support that previous slide, there's about 28% of the facilities that are under a current decommissioning and financial assurance requirement at some level, local, county, or ordinance level. And about 36% of the solar panels within our state have both of those requirements currently. There's about 44%, if you look to the far right, the percentage column, of the panels that are not addressed by financial assurance, but do fall under some decommissioning requirement, meaning how the panels will be removed, how they'll be properly disposed of, and the site returned to its original intended use before the solar facility was established. And then we have about 20% of the total solar panels that are not under not only a financial assurance requirement, but we cannot find where there's a specific decommissioning plan or a plan to walk through what the end of the life of that facility looks like and how it will be returned, like I said, to somewhat of a greenfield status. So this is an important breakout. It includes the number of panels, percentage of panels, and then also the facility percentage that are reflected in these different categories. So this is an important starting point, meaning what counties already require within North Carolina. We were asked by the General Assembly to look more at a state level potential plan, and that's what we worked on. Dylan? So when we worked on this more recent piece of legislation, once again related to House Bill 951, to develop a plan for the General Assembly's consideration for legislative action, and that's the way the session law reads, for financial assurance for these facilities. We reviewed the previous study. Like I said, that's important information and a great document as a starting point. We also included additional stakeholder engagement, and we've touched on some of those entities here regarding the renewable energy industry, investor-owned utilities. Obviously, we spoke to the North Carolina Utilities Commission, their public staff, and also some of their members, and also the North Carolina Electric Membership Corporation and local governments, since a lot of them are already involved with these key decision points on solar facilities, decommissioning, and financial assurance. And as we've stated here this afternoon, we've also reviewed current county level requirements. We showed you the slide depicting those green and yellow highlighted counties, and evaluated the authority that would be needed to implement and administer decommissioning and financial assurance requirements if the General Assembly were to decide this is a state level type program that's needed, and what operational and administrative requirements would be needed to support that type of implementation at the state level, and how and when decommissioning requirements are initiated. So when a facility producing power that's connected to the grid, how is that defined? Is it within a 12-month period, 6-month period? There's different criteria that would need to be discussed and evaluated. And make sure that we had minimum requirements to ensure financial assurance for decommissioning of utility scale solar projects, as part of this plan, as was required by the legislation. Dylan? So some of the key recommendations, now that we've kind of covered some of the background of the legislation that led to this, the previous plan, what some of the counties are already doing across North Carolina, some of the key recommendations were to make sure we define the term utility scale solar. Is that going to be at the 1 megawatt range, greater than 2 megawatt? Make sure that that's clearly established in general statutes and differentiate between what would be considered new facilities based on some certain date potentially in legislation and what would be considered existing facilities. Also make sure that there are statewide minimum standards, and if the General Assembly felt it was necessary to direct a state agency, whether that's DEQ or NCUC, to serve as the state level program administrator, or even designate certain components of the program to both agencies. There are components for our agency, the Department of Environmental Quality, especially on the back end when it comes to decommissioning, how the material's managed, recycled, or if it needed to be disposed of. But there's obviously a lot of work by the Utilities Commission on the front end with these facilities. And also consider providing local government the option to enter into an MOA, a memorandum of agreement, if they felt certain requirements, additional requirements were necessary and needed. Could be the amount of financial assurance or what specifics that county and Board of Commissioners feels is applicable. We wanted to consider that option through MOAs. And that local governments, as I stated, may also establish or retain ordinances that could be more stringent than statewide baseline or minimum requirements. Bill? We also wanted to make sure as some of the additional key recommendations that we established and clarify minimal requirements and rulemaking authority. So this could be something that comes back before this body as the Environmental Management Commission and this committee, if it were decided that this plan needed to be acted on, meaning per legislation, and then which department and state government would need to administer it and rulemaking associated with that. And further detail, regarding rule development and rulemaking, we felt was really an important piece of this. And to allow enough time. It's difficult to stand up a program in weeks or even a few months. It takes time to onboard staff, establish requirements, and definitely to write rules and get them in a good position to present to this body. So we've touched on some timing pieces of that if this is a state level type program that's going to be considered. And the importance of establishing resources to support the administration of the program, how those resources could be funded, and authorizing the administering agency to collect fees if it were needed to cover those other costs of the program. Dylan? So some additional key recommendations. We also wanted to make sure we emphasized in the plan providing resources to encourage economic development to recycle or reuse solar panels. So not just looking at the final endpoint, which could be disposal, but there's a lot before that. What's the opportunities on our current waste hierarchy that's in the North Carolina general statutes for our state to reduce, reuse, recycle before we come to disposal, and how can we help facilitate that? And so there's language in this plan, this first bullet here, to try to support the need for that, whether it's grants or further support of the industry to develop around recycling this potential end-use material. One other important component, the second bullet here, was to establish an annual registration requirement. This is something that was touched on in the previous plan that we briefed this body on, coming out of House Bill 329 and that associated report, but establishing the registration for new and existing utility scale solar facilities. It would disclose the names of the responsible parties, the service life of the facility, timelines, and scope and scale of the projects. Right now, we glean information at the state level, federal level, county level, and we have to put it all together. This registration is a key recommendation in the plan to get a uniform way of accurately collecting this information, keeping it updated, and having it at our fingertips. But also to get into the meat of things in the third bullet, establishing minimum requirements for decommissioning cost estimates and financial assurance mechanisms for new solar facilities. And that's what the legislation asked for. It asked for a plan for financial assurance and where would this be needed. And so we've outlined that in the plan, specifically when it comes to new facilities. And we would require financial assurance mechanisms was one of the recommendations in the plan for new facilities to be established, submitted to the state program administrator 5 years prior to the end of the facility's expected service life. So that's a key piece here. New facilities and the option to consider financial assurance for them, but also when that mechanism would be secured. So you can say financial assurance is needed, but that's not the end of the conversation. When is that letter of credit provided? The bond, the cash in an escrow account, that's a key decision point. And we did look at other states' requirements, county level requirements on when those mechanisms would need to be secured based on the expected life of the facility. Also allow existing facilities. So another key point here, differentiating from new facilities coming into the state versus those that already exist, meaning that universe of the 660 that are already out there. And the recommendation in the plan to allow them to continue to operate under their current decommissioning plans or financial assurance mechanisms if they exist for current utility scale solar facilities. And if and when they make a material or major modification, they add acreage, add panels, add to their megawatt base, then those particular triggers could be evaluated to then require them to submit a decommissioning plan, cost estimate, and financial assurance mechanism. If they didn't change their current operation, the current status of it, then there wouldn't be a requirement for financial assurance as recommended in our current plan. And also maintain the landowner's existing right to specify if something else is needed as the property owner above and beyond the state minimum requirements as outlined in the plan. Dylan. So that's the overview. Like I said, the main pieces here are understanding the relevant legislation, 2 significant pieces of legislation in the past 2 years, asking about financial assurance, even potential regulatory rule development on this front. And then this is our plan that was submitted earlier this month to the General Assembly with specific recommendations on financial assurance. Both of these are available, meaning the pieces of legislation is your attachments. The plan is an additional attachment. The legislation did not require a specific presentation to the General Assembly or co-sign off like the other plan did. So we got this turned in March 1st. And we'll wait to hear additional questions, or follow up from the General Assembly. I would like to recognize, our great team. It takes a village sometimes, and really appreciate Assistant Secretary Mays Moore, who's with us today. Her experience on this front is so needed and really appreciated. Also, Jenny Patterson, an environmental program consultant who's actually working on the universal waste rule for solar panels, was a great part of the team. And Jessica Monty, another environmental program consultant, who really helped draft this plan. And a newer colleague for us, Paula Hemmer, who works in our energy office that's a senior level engineer who really helped with this plan and put it together. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. And like I said, it's been submitted to the General Assembly and the language was written to draft a plan for potential legislative action. So we'll wait to see what the next steps are from there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Director Scott. I had a couple of comments myself before I turn it over to the rest of the committees. It was my recollection from the public staff presentation that we really don't have a list of operating facilities, that they get applications in and they might approve them, but the facility may never get built. So I think the registration plan is one that's sorely needed. So
right. Yeah, you're spot on. There's the process before the Utilities Commission, but that process doesn't quite double back to see that the facility that was actually built. And so you understand it very well. That's why we feel like the registration could be an important foundational piece of this to get all the necessary information to make informed decisions moving forward.
Right. We need to know what we've got.
Yeah.
The other thing is there was that group of 20% of the facilities that seem to have no requirements whatsoever. And in your presentation, you were talking about how new facilities are going to be, are the ones that are focused on. So what happens to that 20%, assuming they don't make any changes? They'll be registered, for example, but then,
that's right.
Then how are you going to deal with them?
Yeah, they will register, but there would not be a requirement for them to submit, financial assurance or a decommissioning plan. They would operate as their current status unless they make a major change to the facility like we talked about. And that's what we implemented, within the department with other facility types, that there's a major change. We call it a major mod. You can almost be considered like a new facility, but they would work, through the process and go through decommissioning, but they just wouldn't have a plan or financial assurance. And so what we found from other states is there's only one state who has placed these requirements on facilities after they were built, West Virginia, and they're not a state that has a large percentage of solar. And so there's only that one example we were able to find where state level legislation has been passed, placing these requirements on existing facilities. And we naturally got a lot of feedback from the industry regarding the 600 plus universe that's already in our state, how they were constructed, the financing associated with them, and their feedback on that potential requirement retrospectively. So we tried to gather all that information, put the best plan forward we could. But those facilities will decommission under the agreements they have with their landowners, to lease
Right.
that property and properly remove the equipment when it's required. And one thing I didn't touch on is, there's a lot of detail here on the cost associated with this and an active dialogue on how much it does cost, because there are valuable components, between the metals that can be recycled and materials that can be taken off site for recycling purposes. So that's another piece to it, meaning salvage value. That's an important part of this discussion.
Okay, and then a lot of times what happens is that the department and the division would possibly come up with model ordinances. Was that a part of the discussion?
Yeah, there's been model ordinances that came out several years back. I can pull that out. I don't have it here in my briefcase with me today, but there were model ordinances that were developed several years back to help counties with this. This approach with this plan would kind of set, if the General Assembly takes it up in legislation, would consider kind of the state minimum requirements. And so that would not take the place of a county ordinance, but it would help with those minimum requirements. And then we recommended that counties could go above and beyond that based on what they feel is appropriate within their own jurisdictions.
Right. I didn't have any more comments or questions. I'll open it up to the rest of the commission members. Commissioner Arata? Oh, I didn't see.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Just thinking a little bit down the road once our program is off the ground, it would be really, really helpful and a huge public service if once you have all that information to create a landing page or something where the public could do something like click on a county on a map and pull up whether it's a state requirement, county requirement, both. And then maybe that registration information, that would be really, really helpful because the hunt that you have to do now to find all that information is definitely time consuming.
Yeah, and thank you for the comment. We have a similar application for our facilities in the Division of Waste Management, and I agree totally. Having that interactive type of map where you could find that information by clicking on the facility would be a great recommendation. And I think that's part of what we envision as the registration process. We don't know if it lands in DEQ or NCUC or some other program. And I didn't say this, but other states implement this various ways. In some states, I think it's Vermont, the Utilities Commission implements all of it. Other states, it's their Department of Environmental Quality. Some other states have a hybrid approach that both bodies do parts of the work. So you'll see a variety of the approaches across the country.
Commissioner Solomon?
More of a general question or request. I don't know that we've been briefed on the energy statute, House 951, and I'd like to request. I know it touches at least two EMC committees and maybe water quality too, but that was passed in November, and I would like to get kind of a comprehensive view so that we can, if we haven't already, so we know all the parts of it that could impact EMC.
Chair
Yeah,
Bailey.
thank you.
Just to Commissioner Solomon's comment, if I may, come to the Air Quality Committee in May because there's going to be a presentation on exactly that.
You missed my request to the whole EMC because I think it attaches, I mean, that is not a committee of the whole. So I think as a committee of the whole, we need to hear that if that's chair's prerogative or whoever's prerogative.
Thank you, Commissioner Solomon. Anyone?
I'll
Commission
certainly be glad to,
Chair Smith.
I'll certainly be glad to coordinate with Chair Arata and see what is workable. I believe they've been working for a while on getting a presentation together for the Air Quality Committee. So I don't know if we can shift that or not, whether that's feasible with the speakers that they've lined up, but we'll discuss that.
Thank you. Any other? Commissioner Yelvington?
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Director Scott, for the presentation. It was very informative. I just wanted to, we, at our committee met with the public staff of the Utilities Commission in January. And one of the things that was brought up in that meeting, that the vast majority of solar facilities are on leased property. And so one of the concerns, so you have 20% of the solar panels are on, are not regulated, or don't have a financial assurance or a decommissioning plan. And some of these homeowners, maybe initially didn't even know how to prepare a contract with a solar facility and take into consideration, what to do with the panels at the end. And a lot of the solar facilities are owned by LLCs, and do we have assurance that they will be there at the end of life of the solar facility? Is the state planning anything to take, these landowners, probably some of them will not have financial capabilities to decommission the solar facility at the end of life. What is the state going to do to prepare for that at the end?
Yeah, so we worked through, great question, thank you for it. We worked through a variety of scenarios. The first point, as we've covered today, all of the legislation was tied to utility scale, whether it's greater than 1 megawatt, as the legislation said, and we even have touched on, we may be able to consider facilities above 2 megawatts. So everything that's considered, legislatively has kind of had that minimum bar, facilities that are greater than that in size. We've looked at some different options to consider, the 20%, meaning where there is no decommissioning or financial assurance requirements. We also recognize, as we stated, though, that some property owners may already have those requirements. We're just not privy to that information through their lease agreements, nor do the counties have it. We've asked counties if they have the specific lease agreements or requirements in it. So we looked at options on that front, as you refer to the 20% here. Naturally, like I said, we looked at what could be the potential concerns, what could be the concern from the property owners and the particular solar developers. And in alignment with other states' legislation, we put forward in this plan the existing facilities. We would let them follow their current plans or requirements if they didn't have them. And I think that's to your point. Then those particular facilities would be closed, per the solar developer's regular plan. And so we've looked at a variety of options. It can be handled multiple ways. The department has other funds and solutions, to deal with end-of-life type scenarios. But the final recommendation here was for the existing facilities to not put that requirement for financial assurance for.
And just to clarify, the 20% we're talking about isn't residential. It's
No. That's right. That's right. That's why I'm trying to emphasize that 1 megawatt utility scale. We're not getting into rooftop solar, residential solar. This is utility scale where it's connected to the electric grid. And like I said, that 1 megawatt is what was in the legislation. We've even said in the plan it could be bumped up to 2 megawatt, meaning facilities greater than 2 megawatt.
And one more question, or just recommendation. With the registration process, one of the presentations we had, I guess it was in November from your department, was talking about there's some solar panels who have or would be considered hazardous waste, some would not. Is there a process? Can you require during the registration to provide what type of solar panel, the model numbers, the information on the solar panels? Then if your department defines that this type of solar panel is an issue, is causing problems, then you will know where those are located. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great comment. We outlined on the slide some of the overarching information as part of the registration, but I think that's a great piece of feedback. Obviously, we've got several different types of panels that are used industry-wide. And to your point, if we could get that information, if this registration process moves forward or is required per legislation, at the state level, that would be a critical piece for us to consider and may help on the management side, knowing that some of the panels may have some hazardous characteristics versus maybe some of the newer panels may not. But yeah, thank you for that. We'll definitely look at including that
Okay.
if this comes forth as a requirement.
Thank you very much.
Are there any other comments or questions? Chair Smith?
I have one question. Is it feasible, if there were to be a state program, is it feasible for those existing facilities to at least set minimum decommissioning requirements apart from requiring financial assurance? I understand the complications of trying to require financial assurance for an existing facility, but is it feasible to break out the decommissioning standards and apply at least some minimum standards to existing facilities?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think there's a variety of options. I think the point you're making is the real monetary side of this is when you secure the financial mechanism, whether it's the bond, the letter of credit, or cash that's provided in an account to the county, or the state. And so I would say the answer is yes. There's the option to look at those other pieces for the existing facilities, that could be required to make sure that that information is readily available. And as you see here, there's a large percentage, 44 plus 36% of the facilities, gets us up in the 80% range of those that are going to have a decommissioning plan, meaning how the panels are going to be removed, how they're going to be disposed of or recycled, and how the site's going to be reclaimed. But that's definitely great feedback that we consider.
Yeah, because I think it's a good comment. I'm just wondering, I know you fought that battle, so you may have some from landfills. But is there a de minimis size or age of landfill or financial line of sight type things? We fought this battle on the landfill side. Does every landfill have a decommissioning plan and financial insurance?
No.
I asked that question
Yeah.
because we've debated it in the Journal Assembly's changed it, but
Right.
are there boundaries or precedents set there that would impact this maybe?
Yeah, based on facility type and scale. So your sanitary landfills are where we typically talk about that, construction, demolition, municipal solid waste. If you're dealing with vegetative waste or small footprint facilities, there's a threshold where you're not going to have those same requirements. I'm speaking of financial assurance.
Right, and good with
decommission.
Chair
Yeah.
Smith, I'm just following on that there probably would be some similar thing that would have to be applied, because I think it's a great idea, but there's probably a threshold or something that some precedent from landfills that would apply to this too, right?
Right. Yep. Agreed. And that's what we've drawn from on the financial assurance pieces, meaning other departmental programs where we have a decommissioning or closure plan and financial assurance. We've looked at those as examples. It's not an apples to apples with solar facilities, but what we could compare and draw from.
Any more comments or questions? Thank you very much, Director Scott. That was great. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but you've already done a lot.
Yes, great team.
The next part of the agenda is what will be seen on the EMC agenda tomorrow. And the first one on this has to do with commercial leaking petroleum or underground storage tank cleanup funds. And Director Scott has an update on that one.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. That's an action item before the full commission tomorrow. Some of my colleagues are here if we need further clarification, but we would like to suggest one clarifying addition to O2P. This will be tomorrow before the full commission. We're just sharing this as an update before the committee. We did see that some of the current language related to pre-approvals of work that's done with our trust fund program, has some certain limitations and some unclear language on it. So we proposed some language to be a little more clear when it comes to those pre-approvals for our UST trust fund program. It would be a small addition to Rule 0402C that the full commission will hear tomorrow. And it would reference when a pre-approval of cost is required and is obtained from the department, the pre-approval would be valid for 1 year from the date it's fully executed. So the commission will be briefed on that tomorrow, but we felt it was applicable to bring that up in committee today. We have, like I said, supporting colleagues here if we need to answer a question or two regarding that suggestion that'll be mentioned tomorrow at the commission.
I got a question. Was this in our package?
I'll have to ask supporting staff if it was added in this. I think we were discussed that we would bring it up before the commission and mention it here in committee. Commissioner Solomon?
Jessica Monte, Division of Waste Management. Yeah, we had sent it to Lois and asked her to update it. So over the weekend, it was showing that change in the presentation and in the attachment A for the full text.
And I just want to add, and it'll be passionate, because I remember when I joined the EMC, there was one group of people that said the department was pulling things on and off the agendas at the last minute, and the public didn't have time to digest it, and it was disrespectful of commissioners to have studied all their homework. And I'm not on you on this specific one, but we feel like we're backsliding back into that again. It's a different administration and maybe a different group of people that would be impacted by it, but it's still not right. That's why we went to agendas 3 weeks ahead of time. That's why, once it gets on the EMC agenda, it's ours, it's not the department's. And I've got a real problem, I'll just tell you, with adding things at the last minute and not delaying that till the next meeting when the committee or the full EMC can digest it. I think it's disrespectful to this EMC and to the public to slide those things in at the last minute. So that's all I'll say for now.
Just say, thank you for that feedback. We understand that side of it, with the constant changes in material cost and cost associated that our consultants are facing. We thought defining this time period would be important to bring before the commission for a discussion. Like I said, ultimately it's the commission's decision, and we understand the timing piece. So thank you for that feedback. And that's why we wanted to bring it up today, and mention that it was added. We recognize it wasn't added 2 weeks before. There was discussion with council, Council Reynolds, on this, and we just felt it was something, as these rules made it through the process, it was worth bringing up. But thank you for the comments on the timing, and we do recognize that, and ultimately it's commission's decision regarding it.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear, I'm not knocking you particularly in this case, but we have a lot of things getting pushed on the agenda and things we don't see a week or two in advance when we're doing our homework. And I really think at some point we've got to just pull them off the agenda and just decide not to hear them if you guys aren't ready. Yep. So it's not just you, it's all the departments. Yep. But we don't want to get where we were 6 or 8 years ago, where things are haphazardly getting thrown on and off the agenda on Tuesday or Wednesday before the meeting. I just don't want to see that happening.
Thank you, Commissioner Solomon. I think Council Reynolds wants to speak on this.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And to Commissioner Solomon's larger point, I'm not addressing that, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that I was the one that strongly encouraged the staff that if they had any additions, then this one particular addition, that now would be the time to bring it before the commission, let the commission decide tomorrow if it wanted to proceed to public comment with that included as part of the package, rather than waiting until the end of it and trying to put it in. So I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. That was my strong encouragement, to have them bring that forward and put that in even at this moment. I don't want I don't want that to go unnoticed, that it was that I'm the one that prompted them to do that. So hopefully the commission will consider it tomorrow and determine whether they should include it.
And this was an item that was before the committee, and what we're doing is, what the idea is that we're going to add this in for the, so
Right,
it's before the whole commission, so it hasn't gone out to public notice yet.
Right.
It's what we want to do, and this will be included in the package. It's just, it is a change from what the committee approved last time.
Right.
Thank you, Commissioner Solomon. I mean, I think those points are well taken. And the rest of the items, do you have any other comments? And is Director Smith here? On the rest of the EMC items, is there anything to add that on the ones that are going to be heard tomorrow? Nothing to add. And then you'll see we have future committee interests, and now we're off to director's remarks. So Director Scott, do you have anything to add?
No, just thank you for the committee's attention today on these items and for the discussion on this one possible change that will be suggested tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. And Director Smith, do you have anything to add? Yes, we appreciate your staff. They've really worked hard on all of this. Well, I want to thank everybody for being here today and for the fine presentations we had. We're moving through the solar panel project little by little. So I would move to adjourn the meeting.
Thank you.